Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'll show you some opening traps to avoid. Another thing that I'd like you to remember from this lesson is that no matter how early in the game, you need to pay attention to different little traps. Generally, I recommend to simply use common sense in the opening stage of the game, such as developing your pieces, making sure you put your king in safety, and of course control the center. Well, that's very true. However, it doesn't mean that you can neglect paying attention to different tactical traps. Let me illustrate some of those examples. The first example we will see in some books is called as the OMG trap. Well, let's see how that pans out. Okay, it starts out e4, e5 as all of our examples in this lesson. Knight f3, normal developing move, immediately targeting black's e5 pawn, and black protected it with the knight. And now the white bishop developed to c4, and this is the beginning of the Italian game. In this position, black's two most common and best responses are either to develop with the bishop to c5 or develop the knight to f6. Generally, we do not recommend moving the same piece twice, as black did in this game, playing knight d4. It's not a good move, but it sets a famous trap. White could, for example, simply trade knights and double up black's pawns on the d-file. It should certainly give white some advantage. Another option is to simply castle and continue with development. And thirdly, white could play also c3, chasing the black knight out of the center, and after the trade capture back with the queen, with again a superior position for white. However, let's see what is the trap that I advise you to avoid. If white captures the pawn on e5, which at first looks like a safe move, as no black piece can capture the knight right now, white just won a pawn. In fact, white is now targeting a second pawn on f7. Moreover, if that knight gets there, that would be a fork over the black queen and rook in the corner. Quite amazingly, after black's next correct move, black will already have a winning advantage. This is quite remarkable. I suggest you take a moment and try to figure it out on your own. What may be that special move that indeed causes white so much trouble that white will not be able to avoid either losing material or even getting checkmated? Well, hopefully you had some ideas that are the right ones. And that move is for black to play queen g5. Well, this move attacks, of course, the white knight on e5 on one hand, and on the other hand, white's pawn on g2. Let's first see what happens if white follows up by capturing on f7 and winning a second pawn and putting the black queen and rook in a fork. Of course, we can see that the knight on f7 is well protected by white's bishop on c4, so of course black is unable to capture the knight. However, black is very well able to capture the pawn on g2. And what is happening now? What has happened now is that the black queen is attacking the white rook in the corner. And if that rook moves to a safe square on f1, black will capture the pawn on e4 with a check, and now, as unfortunate as white is, the king cannot move, and if the bishop blocks the check, black is ready to checkmate with a smothered mate, thanks to the pin over the white bishop. Quite remarkable, just 7 moves and white is already checkmated. Let's go back just a tiny bit in the game. After the starting moves, bishop c4, Italian game, knight d4, knight captures pawn on e5, queen goes to g5. And let's talk for a moment about other options. First of all, if white protects the g2 pawn, the problem is that black simply wins a piece. Of course, it's much better than getting checkmated, but nevertheless, it's not a good thing to lose a knight at such an early stage of the game, or in fact, pretty much at any stage of the game. So let's go back and look at the move that again looks quite tempting, capturing the pawn on f7 with the bishop and with a check. Well then, the black king will move out simply to e7, and now the catch is that if the white knight moves away, the bishop will be hanging on f7, and of course if the bishop moves, the knight is hanging on e5, while in some cases black would choose also to take the pawn on g2. Quite an amazing game. Let's go on and see our second example in this lesson. Again, the game starts out with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. So far exactly the same as the previous game, and here white varies by playing knight c3. And now we have reached the 4 knights game. And here white can develop in various ways, but the most common and perhaps most respected is to play bishop b5, the most ambitious way. Now white has ideas such as trading bishop for knight and then trying to win a pawn on e5. Black's very popular response here is to play knight d4, which temporarily sacrifices a pawn in the middle of the board. White indeed captured that pawn, and black responded by playing an unusual move in that it moves the queen out early. However, in this case, the particular reason is to win a pawn, or rather win a pawn back. Now the white knight is being attacked, and if indeed that knight retreats, for example, to f3, then black will be ready to win the pawn back with knight captures pawn, and of course white cannot win a piece by knight takes knight, because not only that black will win the piece back thanks to the discovered check, now that the white king is attacked, white needs to attend to that, to the check, and then white will lose the queen. So going back to the game after queen e7, white can do better than that and protect the knight, at least for now. Now what black would like to do is to chase the knight away on e5 by playing d6. The problem is that would be an illegal move for the time being, and that explains black's next move, which was the exchange of the knight for the bishop on b5, and when white captured back, now black is ready to play d6. So far the game was pretty interesting, but both sides played quite okay. And this is the moment when white had to be super careful, avoiding falling in the trap. The white knight has only one good move in this position. All other options are rather bad and lose material. The only good square for a white knight in this position is to retreat the knight to f3. Even though, in that case as well, black's position is quite comfortable after queen captures on e4. On the other hand, it is a major blunder to retreat the knight to d3, because then black will not go for the pawn on e4, but go for a whole lot more, namely bishop g4, and now the white queen is all of a sudden trapped. Very well done for black. Let's move on to the next example, which trap in some books is considered as the Noah's Ark trap. And let's see this trap that comes from the Ruy Lopez opening. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. We're getting familiar with this one. And now bishop b5. This is defined already as the Ruy Lopez. Now black has numerous ways to play, in addition to the main line which we will see in the game. In recent years it has become rather popular not to play a6 first, but to play knight f6 immediately. And it can lead to a very balanced and interesting game. But now let's look at a6, which again puts white in front of a crossroad. The bishop can trade for the knight or can retreat to a4 as white did in this example. Let's just look for a moment what may happen after the bishop trade for the knight. It's considered better to capture back with the d-pawn, which right away opens the diagonal of black's bishop as well as the d-file for the black queen. It's quite a known trap that now capturing the pawn on e5 doesn't really give any advantage for white, because the black queen will immediately go to d4, double attack the white knight as well as the pawn on e4, win the pawn back, and then have a rather comfortable position. So for white this is only a temporary gain, and it's much more advisable, if white already has traded the bishop for a knight on c6, at this juncture to simply castle, just like Bobby Fischer did in his times in many games. So going back to the position after the bishop has been attacked, it's more advisable to retreat the bishop to a4 if white wants a more dynamic game. After bishop a4 came d6, which is not considered the main moves. The most popular move is considered knight f6, and of course the theory is just about to begin here. But here black played d6 and white played d4, which is a somewhat risky move already because it allows the following trap. b5, an important move because now the knight on c6 will be no longer pinned. In this case, after pawn captures and knight captures, we can see how the bishop on a4 is pinning black's knight in c6. So let's go back and see how the game proceeds after b5. The bishop needs to move away from the attack, and now, remember this idea, a very important one, black will trade on d4, knight trades, and pawn captures back. And here comes the key trap that's important to remember. If white now captures back with the queen on d4, then already black is in a much better position, because black can gain the momentum by attacking white's queen, and now if the queen retreats to some random square, the bishop will be simply trapped. So white's best approach is to right now try to play queen d5, attack black's rook, as well as threaten to checkmate on f7. However, this doesn't help either, because black can defend against both and counterattack all at the same time. Black can play bishop e6, a very powerful move, not only attacks white's queen, but also protects all of a sudden the hanging rook in the corner. And now if white plays queen c6 check, trying not to give black time to trap the bishop on b3, but again black blocks the check with a counterattack. And now already that the queen is protecting the rook in the corner, when the white queen again retreats to d5, now only with a single threat of the checkmate on f7, then comes finally c4 and the white bishop is trapped. A very famous trap and a very important one to remember. Before we go any further, let's just go back a little bit to the position after the trades just happened on d4. What should white do if not capturing the pawn on d4? Well, the best move right now for white is to play bishop to d5, an intermediate move, and only when the black rook reacts to this attack, only then capture the pawn with a fine position for white. And yet another option is, if we go back a little bit after d6, and we saw d4 and b5 and bishop b3 and knight captured on d4, knight captures, pawn captures. We saw queen d4 not being good at all, bishop d5 the best choice, and in some games white has even experimented by playing c3, an interesting move as well, although clearly much more risky than bishop d5. And now let's go to our final example in this lesson. This game starts out again the same way: e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and now not the Ruy Lopez, not the four knights, not the Italian, but the Scotch, d4. In this position, black's best option is to trade pawns, and now, of course, black has many options. One is to develop the bishop to c5. Another one, the sharpest one of them all, is to play queen h4, or as black played, knight f6 in this game. Now the pawn is hanging on e4, so white needs to react to this. White here has two main and popular moves. One is the exchange of knights, which will force the doubling of the black pawns, and the other is the simple developing move knight c3, which simply protects the pawn on e4. Interestingly, white tried a move that's neither of those two, and protected the e4 pawn by indirectly pinning the black knight on f6. Now, of course, black cannot capture on e4, because then the white bishop would capture the black queen. So black tried to unpin the knight. Now that there is the black bishop also on that same diagonal, black has renewed the threat of capturing the pawn on e4. After bishop e7, white continued with playing knight f5, an ambitious move which immediately targets the pawn on g7. Instead of it, exchanging knights was certainly also a reasonable option. And now the game became rather interesting and black played rather risky. The normal move here would be to simply castle, but black chose to play d5. Interestingly, the capture on g7 is not quite as simple as it first seems. Black would move the king to f8. Now, if the white knight retreats, for example, to f5, black would be ready to win a pawn back on e4. Therefore, the more challenging answer is here for white to play bishop h6, threatening with some very scary discovered checks. For example, knight e6 would be a very strong move, being a double check, and also attacking the black queen. However, things are not quite as simple, because black will move out of that threat, of that discovery, and then threaten to play knight g4, which would attack the white bishop on h6, and of course knowing that if that bishop moves away, then the knight on g7 will remain unprotected. So let's go back again and see how the game continued after black played d5. And now white in the game captured the pawn on d5. Well, it's true that now the white knight is hanging on f5, which in fact black could have captured. And then if pawn captures the black knight, black can trade queens and then capture back on c6. Or there are some interesting opportunities even to play knight g4 and all of a sudden attack on f2. Let's go back again and see how the game continued. After ed5, black chose a different move, a more peaceful move, by playing knight e5, although the bishop takes knight was a better option. And here white certainly should have taken on g7 and then play bishop h6, renewing the discovered check attack. Another option that was pretty good for white in this position was to play bishop b5 check. Both of those moves would have given white some advantage. Instead, in the game, white captured knight takes bishop. Of course, the queen captures back. Black wouldn't want to take with the king, because then the king could no longer castle in this game. And in this moment, white still has a solid advantage, if they would have found the correct move, which was to simply develop with the bishop, making sure the king doesn't get in trouble. It's important to see that if now black plays queen b4 check, and then white's correct response is to come back with the bishop, because if the queen tries to capture on b2, all of a sudden, not just that white can save the rook in the corner by playing bishop c3, but at the same time create a fork by attacking the black queen and knight simultaneously. Of course, black is not forced to capture that pawn on b2, but why did the queen go there in the first place if now it cannot capture the pawn and needs to retreat? So white would have maintained his advantage playing bishop e2 in this position, but white made a careless move, and that's one of the things I'd like to point out as a theme of this lesson, that no matter how early in the game, be alert, be attentive to the threats of the opponent. In this case, white blundered by capturing the knight and allowing an immediate checkmate. Don't assume automatically that your opponent will recapture. Look around and always, always search for the opponent's best moves as well, not just of your own. Right here, black checkmates immediately with knight f3. Well, I hope I gave you some interesting opening ideas which you may use to trap your opponent, but more likely to simply make sure you don't fall in it. As we saw in the first game, black made a significant risk, making an objectively inferior move than they could, hoping that white would fall in the trap. Generally, that's not a good strategy. Always try to look for the best move you can, not just for a trap, because what if the opponent doesn't fall for it? Well, thank you for listening, and be back next week for some more chess knowledge. Bye-bye.